Imagine waking up this morning. You go to the bathroom, turn on the hot water, brush your teeth, make a cup of coffee, all within 15 minutes. Now take all of that away. No running water, no soap, no toothbrush, no electricity, no toilet. Just you, the morning, and a world that most modern people would not survive their first week in. But here is the strange part. The people who lived in that world did not think they were living a hard life. They were simply living. And some of the things they did every day would amaze you. Some would make you sick. And some of them you are still doing right now without even knowing it. This is an ordinary day in the life of your ancestors. In 1700 BC, at the Palace of Knossos on the island of Crete, there was something that most civilizations of the time did not have: a bathtub. Not a modern bathtub. It was a clay tub about 1.5 meters long, slightly curved at both ends, placed in a separate room with a system that brought water in and drained water out. The Minoans, the civilization that built Knossos, had solved the problem of hygiene with engineering that Europeans would not reinvent for more than 3,000 years. But that was the aristocracy. The rest of the world was different. In ancient Egypt, bathing was a social ritual, not a private activity. People bathed together along the banks of the Nile or used large clay basins. Instead of soap, they used a mixture of vegetable oils and wood ash. The alkali in the ash reacted with the oil, creating a crude cleaning agent. After that, they used a smooth stone or a curved bronze tool called a strigil to scrape the dirty oil off their skin. Read that sentence again. They did not wash the dirt away with water. They scraped it off their skin. The Greeks and Romans used the strigil more often than they bathed with water. After competing, athletes would cover themselves in olive oil, exercise, and then scrape off the entire mixture of oil and sweat. The sweat scraped from famous athletes, which the Romans called gloios, was sold on the streets as a tonic and cosmetic. People bought other people's sweat to put on their skin. In Babylon, ancient India, and Shang Dynasty China, bathing water was much less common. Bathing every day was a luxury for the wealthy. Most people used damp cloths to clean themselves, especially areas of the body that were prone to infection. But there was one interesting thing. Ancient people understood that skin needed to be protected, not just cleaned. Egyptians used castor oil and animal fat as moisturizers. Mesopotamians used sesame oil. The idea of skincare was not invented by the 21st century. It was simply repackaged and sold for 100 times the price. This is the part that most history books leave out. But it may be the part that reveals the most about how a civilization actually functioned. In ancient Rome, public toilets, which the Romans called foracae, were among the most carefully engineered structures in the empire. They consisted of long rows of stone seats with holes carved into them, placed side by side with no partitions. Beneath them ran a continuous flow of water that carried waste away. There was no privacy. None at all. Romans used the toilet together the way modern people eat lunch together. Public toilets were places to meet, exchange news, and discuss business. Senators discussed imperial policy while sitting on those stone seats, side by side, with nothing separating them. But the real question is, what did they use to clean themselves afterward? The answer was the xylospongium, a long stick with a sponge attached to the end. After use, it was dipped into a bucket of salt water or vinegar and then placed back on the rack for the next person to use. Shared by everyone, every day. Scientists who analyzed Roman toilet remains found evidence of intestinal parasites in the drainage systems significantly higher than in civilizations without sanitation systems. There is a painful irony here. They built the most sophisticated sewage systems in the ancient world, yet sharing cleaning tools unintentionally spread more infections. In Asia, during the same period, the story was different. Han Dynasty China used thin bamboo slips, practical and not shared. Japan later developed private toilets much earlier than Europe. And the Indus Valley civilization at Mohenjo-Daro had personal toilets in individual households as early as 2500 BC, more than 2,000 years before Rome. Medieval Europe, on the other hand, was much simpler. A chamber pot sat beneath the bed. In the morning, its contents were thrown directly out the window onto the street. The streets of 13th century Paris were not a place where you wanted to walk without looking down at your feet. In AD 79, one day before Mount Vesuvius erupted, what were the people of Pompeii doing? Archaeologists found the answer in a layer of ash that preserved the city almost perfectly for nearly 2,000 years. And the answer surprised many researchers. They were living almost exactly like we do. Pompeii had 35 bakeries. It had 20 fast food restaurants called thermopolia, street food counters with stone containers built into the countertop to keep food warm, much like a modern buffet. The city had 2 theaters, an arena, and a large public bath complex with hot rooms, warm rooms, cold rooms, exercise areas, and gardens for walking. The average Roman, after finishing work, usually around midday, because the workday began at sunrise, would go to the public baths, not just to bathe. They went there to meet friends, play games, listen to music, and take part in discussions. The Roman bathhouse was the social network of the ancient world. It was where news spread, where relationships were built, where you learned who was rising and who was falling. But it was not just Rome. In Tang Dynasty China, people gathered at tea houses to listen to storytellers, a real profession, with professional storytellers being paid to keep audiences listening for hours. In ancient Greece, attending performances at the amphitheater was considered a civic duty, not just entertainment. The government paid for tickets for citizens who could not afford them. The government subsidized culture to make sure everyone had access to the arts, and children played with toys that were not very different from those of today. Archaeologists have discovered clay dolls, spinning tops, balls made from inflated pig bladders, and miniature clay toy sets that recreated family life in ancient Egypt as early as 2000 BC. Some dolls had movable arms and legs. 5,000 years ago. Human beings have not changed. Only the materials used to make the toys have changed. In 1780, William Addis was sitting in a prison in London. He had been imprisoned for inciting a riot. During the long, boring days in his cell, he realized something that billions of people before him had accepted without question. Using a piece of cloth or a finger to clean teeth was truly ineffective. He obtained a few bristles from a prison guard, tied them to a small piece of bone, and created the first modern toothbrush. After being released, he mass-produced it and became wealthy. But what did people do before Addis? As early as 5000 BC, the ancient Egyptians used a mixture of crushed cattle bones, crushed eggshells, resin, and pumice stone, combining them into a coarse abrasive powder. They used their fingers or the frayed end of a chewed stick to rub it onto their teeth. This formula was not completely unreasonable. Pumice stone really could remove plaque. Resin had mild antibacterial properties, but it was also abrasive enough to wear down tooth enamel over time. The Romans added an even more unusual ingredient, urine. Not because they lacked alternatives, because urine contains ammonia, and ammonia is an effective whitening agent. Urine imported from Portugal was taxed separately in Rome as a valuable commercial commodity, used for both laundering clothes and cleaning teeth. People paid money to buy other people's urine to rinse their mouths. In Tang Dynasty China during the 7th century, toothbrushes made from wild boar bristles attached to bone or bamboo handles appeared, the closest version to the modern toothbrush before Addis. And Arab societies used miswak sticks from the Salvadora persica tree. Modern research confirms that this plant contains natural fluoride, antibacterial compounds, and mildly abrasive silica. The World Health Organization still recommends miswak as an effective oral hygiene solution in regions where toothbrushes are not easily available. Your ancestors accidentally discovered fluoride thousands of years before scientists understood why it worked. One evening in Athens, in 400 BC, an ordinary craftsman's family sat around a low table. On the table was bread made from wheat or barley, the foundation of every meal. A bowl of lentils or chickpeas stewed with onions and dill. Some preserved olives. If it was a lucky day, there might also be a little goat cheese or salted fish. Meat was rare, not because they did not like meat, because meat was expensive. An ordinary craftsman in Athens could afford meat about 2 or 3 times a month. The rest of the time, the diet consisted of grains, beans, vegetables, and fish, especially salted dried fish, a food that lasted a long time and was much cheaper. In Rome, the urban poor often did not have their own kitchens. Small apartments in multi-story buildings called insulae were so vulnerable to fire that cooking indoors was restricted or completely prohibited. They ate at thermopolia, street food shops, or bought prepared food to take home. Fast food was not an invention of the 20th century. It was an inevitable solution to urbanization. In Han Dynasty China, an ordinary family dinner included rice or millet, vegetables stir-fried in sesame oil, tofu. The technique for making tofu had existed since the 2nd century BC, and bone broth. Seasonings were far more diverse than those used by Europeans of the same period. Ginger, onions, garlic, and many types of fermented sauces. Chinese cuisine is not a tradition of modern people. It is a legacy built from more than 2,000 years of uninterrupted culinary development. But there was one thing that most ancient civilizations included in their evening meals that we have almost completely abandoned: fermentation. Sauerkraut, fish sauce, fermented beans, pickled vegetables. Before refrigeration, fermentation was the only way to preserve food through the winter. An average family in medieval Europe consumed more probiotics in a single day than a modern person consumes in an entire year. Your ancestors may have had a healthier gut microbiome than you do, and they had no idea why. Before electricity, how did people keep warm? Winter in London, in 1600. The temperature outside dropped below freezing. Inside a typical brick house belonging to the working class, an entire family, 4 to 6 people, was sleeping in a single room, on a single bed. Not because they were too poor to own more beds, because it was the only way to stay warm. Human body heat was the most effective and free source of warmth. Sleeping in the same bed with several people was not a habit born of poverty. It was a carefully calculated survival strategy. In medieval and early modern Europe, a bed was not a private object. When traveling, you slept in the same bed as strangers at inns. That was completely normal and widely accepted. Innkeepers charged by the number of people in the bed, not by the number of beds. But body heat was not enough when it became truly cold. That was when ancient people became creative. The Romans developed the hypocaust system, a hollow floor with space underneath that allowed hot air from a furnace to circulate below. This was underfloor heating. A technology we consider modern was being used by the Romans as early as the 1st century BC. When the Roman Empire collapsed, this technology disappeared from Europe for nearly 1,000 years. The Koreans independently developed the ondol system, a stone floor heated by smoke from cooking fires that traveled through channels beneath the floor. This technology existed on the Korean peninsula more than 2,000 years ago and remains the basic principle behind modern underfloor heating systems. In the far northern regions, the Inuit built snow houses. The temperature inside an igloo could reach 16 degrees Celsius while the temperature outside was minus 40 degrees. The dome-shaped design distributed the pressure of the snow. The entrance was positioned lower to prevent cold winds from blowing inside. Thick layers of snow provided better insulation than many building materials used by southern civilizations. An igloo was not a primitive shelter built by primitive people. It was a thermal engineering structure designed to perform optimally in one of the harshest environments on Earth. What did it feel like to wake up in ancient Rome? There were no alarm clocks. That did not mean there was no sense of time. The Romans divided the day into 12 hours, but the length of each hour changed with the seasons. Summer hours were longer than winter hours. Their concept of an hour was not fixed. It was 1/12 of the time between sunrise and sunset, whether the day was long or short. You woke up at sunrise, not because of habit, but because it was the only time when light was free. Artificial lighting was extremely expensive. An olive oil lamp burned about 10 grams of oil per hour. At Roman oil prices, keeping a lamp lit for one night cost about 1/10 of a common laborer's daily wage. Poor people went to sleep when the sun set and woke up when the sun rose, simply because they could not afford to live any other way. Morning in Rome began with noise. Not music. Noise. The poet Martial, writing in the 1st century, complained about this in his poetry. The hammering of blacksmiths began at sunrise. Street vendors shouted their wares. School children recited lessons aloud in classrooms that opened directly onto the street. The sound of wagons echoed through the city. Because wagons were banned from traveling during the day, all goods transportation took place at night, creating a constant rumble throughout the late hours. Rome, the first city in history to reach a population of 1 million, was one of the noisiest places any human being had ever lived. A typical Roman breakfast consisted of bread, dipped in vinegar or olive oil, sometimes accompanied by cheese or olives. The main meal was dinner, cena, which usually began in the middle of the afternoon. The Romans did not have the concept of 3 fixed meals a day. They ate when they were hungry and when food was available. But there was one thing Romans did every morning that has almost completely disappeared from the modern world. Every morning, people of lower status, clients, dependents, and those seeking favors lined up outside the homes of wealthy patrons to greet them and receive assistance. The patron opened his house at sunrise and met with each person one by one. The Romans called this ritual salutatio. This was the real social network of Rome. There was no email, no telephone. Every favor, every opportunity, every piece of information passed through those mornings spent standing in line. What did ancient homes smell like? This is a question that no museum can fully answer. But modern forensic science and chemical analysis of archaeological remains have helped researchers reconstruct part of the picture. The short answer is very different from what you are used to. The first smell was smoke. In almost every home before the 19th century, smoke from fireplaces, oil lamps, and wax torches soaked into the walls, clothing, hair, and every surface. Ancient people did not notice the smell of smoke on themselves because they did not know life could be any different. The second smell was animals. In most agricultural civilizations, livestock lived near or inside the home during the winter, both to share warmth and to protect them from theft. The smell of animal manure was an inseparable part of daily life. The third smell was fermenting food. A typical home always had jars of fermenting foods, pickled vegetables, fish sauce, and preserved produce, creating a distinctive sour and pungent smell. The fourth smell, surprisingly, was herbs. Ancient people scattered dried herbs such as rosemary, mint, and lavender across their floors to mask unpleasant odors and repel insects. As people walked across the floor, their feet crushed the dried herbs and released their fragrance. When you spray lavender perfume, you are recreating the smell of a medieval floor. It's just that no one tells you that.